Welcome to another session of On Track Parenting. I'm Liza Gant, and I am a mom of 4 kids, with my oldest is 7 and my youngest is 2. And I've been blessed to be a part of our children's ministry for more than 20 years. Now, there's no specific order to these sessions, but you are free to pick a topic that sounds good to you. It is important this time to watch the Potholes of Parenting Part 1 before you watch this session, which is Part 2 of our potholes discussion. Now, AC mentioned in the first pothole session, on our parenting journey, there are potholes everywhere. And even though some of those potholes are put in place by our kids or just part of the natural process of parenting, the two biggest potholes, the two potholes that can carry long-term consequences for our children and our relationship with them, are put in place by us, by mom and her dad. The first pothole, and AC talked about this, is the pothole of being disconnected with our children. So if you skipped that session for some reason, you should probably go check it out before we continue. So press pause, go ahead, I'll wait. All right, so pothole number 1, being disconnected from our kids. Are you ready for pothole number 2? The second pothole of parenting, and one that's proven to be a source of great pain for children and parents, is the pothole of being discontent with our kids. As a marriage and family therapist, I can attest that discontentment is a significant factor in many family struggles. The list is a long one: financial discontent, career discontent, intimacy discontent, being discontented with the physical appearance of our spouse, discontent with the amount of effort he or she puts into the relationship, discontentment with his or her priorities. The list can go on and on and on. Discontentment bears all sorts of bad fruit in a marriage relationship, and it can completely destroy our relationship with our children, not to mention the long-term psychological damage it can cause. The reality is this: being discontent with your children is more than a pothole. It's a crater. Being discontent with our children often starts in little areas, and if left unchecked, builds over time. Here are a few examples. Maybe you played sports as a child, but your children show no interest, and it bothers you. Maybe you were a good student, but your child isn't, and you put extra pressure on him. You're frustrated that your teenager just doesn't get it in one area or another. Or maybe your college-age student didn't get into the college of your choice. You've certainly heard somebody say, perhaps you've even said it yourself, that they can never live up to their parents' expectations, that mom or dad was never satisfied, that there was no such thing as good enough. A legacy of children carrying those types of memories awaits the parent who is consistently discontent with their kids. Certainly most parents don't plan to be discontent with their children. As I mentioned a moment ago, it usually starts in smaller areas, and if left unchecked, grows over time. So where does the pothole of discontentment with our children start, and what does it grow into? I actually think it's a cycle we need to be aware of as parents so we don't get caught up in it. Discontentment with our children almost always starts with comparing. Now, Merriam-Webster says that to compare is to examine the character or qualities of, especially in order to discover the resemblances or differences. And we can compare in 2 directions, downwards and upwards. So if we're comparing our kids downwards, they're head and shoulders above the rest. And we do this at every phase and stage of life. For example, at least my teenager doesn't behave like his buddy, or my baby is so developed and mature he started walking at 6 months old. Well, we can also then compare in the other direction, upward. The comparison trap swings in the opposite direction. We think, if only my kids were better behaved, if only they were more studious or tried as hard as his or her best friend. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." So let's go back to those 2 directions that we can compare in. When you can compare downwards, there may be a false sense of joy as you seem to rejoice in your child's superiority over others. But then pride, arrogance, higher expectations, it all sneaks in. But then when you compare upwards, your child can never ever be good enough. Whatever direction you compare in, joy is stolen away. And let me talk for a second directly to any of you moms or dads who have more than one child. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a mama of a tribe of 4. Comparison amongst your own children can be the most dangerous trap there is. Yes, they all share the same DNA. But yes, they are all wildly and vastly different. Just because one was potty trained by the age of 2 does not mean something is terribly wrong or deficient with your newly potty trained 4-year-old. One child may be a star athlete, while one child shines in academic decathlon, and then you might feel like another child just seemingly exists. Beware of the comparison trap, because comparing leads to the second phase of the discontentment cycle. That's complaining. Complaining makes the move from what may have been an internal comparison to now a clearly expressed communication of grief, pain, or discontent. Complaining transforms the comparison trap into a snarling, biting monster. Don't get me wrong, we all have, do, and will have needs to complain and vent about the realities of parenting. It is not all rainbows and roses. It's inevitable. There are the explosive diapers, embarrassing visits with the principal, and even catastrophic choices made by our teenagers. But the kind of complaining I'm talking about is when you are expressing the grief, pain, or discontent caused by your child to a spouse, friend, coworker, small group member, basically anyone outside of your internal dialogue. These complaints often arise out of the unmet expectations or failing to measure up in the comparison trap. Complaining becomes more about what your child is or is not doing. Complaining is bred out of a heart of discontentment with their behavior, decisions, words, and deeds. It can easily turn into venting for the sake of venting and not seeking out wise counsel or prayer. As we'll talk about soon enough, complaining can be addressed and cut off. In fact, if the cycle stopped here, it probably wouldn't be tough to break the cycle, and the pothole of discontentment could be relatively easy to repair at this juncture. But unfortunately, the discontentment cycle rarely stops here. So complaining about our kids, more often than not, then leads to criticizing. So let's go back to it for a moment and review. It starts as the comparison trap, which can be covert, internal, negative, but mostly thoughts in our head. Then it can slowly but surely leak out into complaints said out loud to ourselves or even other people, but less covert and still done in a manner of talking about our kids without them necessarily in our presence. But then we go to criticism. We turn the corner into a more overt and sometimes outright face-to-face habit. Merriam-Webster defines criticizing as finding fault with or pointing out the faults of. We are now no longer talking about our kids to others. We are flat out calling them out, harshly and negatively, about their mess-ups, problems, and shortcomings. Of course our children need to be called out when they mess up, but there is a stark difference between teaching opportunities and then criticizing our kids. So again, if we go back to the first two, comparison and complaining, they tend to be in the absence of our children. We can rationalize comparison and complaining with no harm, no foul, meaning what our kids don't know we think or say won't hurt them. Well, then criticizing goes on to sharing with our children the comparisons and complaints. No longer are we just thinking or complaining about, why can't you be more like your brother, best friend, or teammate? We are now outright telling our child that we see this as their issue. And in no way is this done in a helpful or nurturing way. Trust me, your kids hear the comparisons and complaints and criticism, and it hurts. The stings, the damage from criticism, it's like a barbed bristle directly into your child's heart. The why can't you be more like your sister, or if only you could read as well as your classmates, plays over and over again like a dreaded tape recorder. Whether it's your 3-year-old's little mind or your much more developed college student's mind, these words can leave deep and heavy impressions. And if the cycle isn't broken at this point, it will lead to the most damaging practice of all. That's condemning. Now we come full cycle. The internal comparisons that leaked out into shared complaining abouts then morphed into expressed criticizing and can oftentimes become internal again into condemnation. Now let me explain. First, relying again on trusty old Merriam-Webster, condemning is defined as declaring to be reprehensible, wrong, or evil, usually after weighing evidence and without reservation. Wow, yikes. Let me say that definition again. Condemning is defined as declaring to be reprehensible, wrong, or evil, usually after weighing evidence and without reservation. Now I know you're thinking, I would never condemn my child, but we're all susceptible to this if not already found guilty and charged of condemning our kids. Condemning becomes an issue of our parenting hearts. It's no longer about seemingly innocent comparisons, petty complaints, or even snippy criticism. Condemning now impacts how we treat our children. We now have our minds made up that this is how he or she is. Now we can easily get stuck in a rut of repeating the discontentment cycle over and over again. For example, if I added together the poor choices, bad behavior, and embarrassing quirks of my son, compounded with comparing him to his seemingly all-star friends, I'm only setting him up for failure in how I see him and treat him. He will inevitably then live up to my condemned mindset and view of him. And imagine how much worse the impact is if I take it to the next level of expressing it to him. Verbalized condemnation is devastating. When you speak words of condemnation, guilt, disappointment over your children, you are setting them up for a lifetime of feeling inadequate, unvalued, and unloved. Here are some practical examples of what condemnation can look like. Like when we say you never or you always. Overgeneralizations happen when we're frustrated. What about when you bring up past mistakes over and over and over again? Or when you refuse to let trust be rebuilt after they've broken it? This is a big one for you parents of teenagers. Or what about when you begin to treat your child in a certain way because of his faults or shortcomings? Like, he'll never go to college, he's just not that smart or hardworking. Or overemphasizing physical appearance when your child struggles with weight. The list goes on and on. But just like my hope and prayer is that you would not stay in the cycle of discontent, let's move to get out of the cycle. Like I said earlier, none of us set out and try to be discontent parents. It's likely not on our list of parenting goals. But far too many of us find ourselves where we're fully in it, stuck in the middle of the discontentment cycle. When it comes to our kids, we can get in a habit of comparing, complaining, criticizing, and condemning. I wonder, how's that working out? So what do? How can we break the discontentment cycle? Or better yet, avoid it altogether? The answer is pretty easy, but the practice is a lot tougher. To avoid or break the cycle of discontentment with your children, to avoid this pothole, you must commit to the exact opposite parenting practices. So first, you refuse to compare your children to others, and instead you celebrate their uniqueness. God knew what he was doing when he created your child. Who are we to really question the master designer? Now it says in the Bible, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." Psalm 139, 13-14. Memorize that verse when you have those struggles of comparison. Be reminded that your works, God, are wonderful. My child is wonderful, and I know that full well. We all can use that reminder when comparison sets in. The second solution to avoid or get out of the pothole of discontentment is to commit to complain a little less. Don't get me wrong, when you signed up to be a parent, you signed up for frustration. Yes, your children will fall short. They will fall short a lot. As a parent, though, you have a choice in how you respond, because after all, you're going to fall short too, a lot. Remember what it says in Philippians 2:4. Do everything without complaining and arguing. Again, it says do everything. So doing your best to stop complaining. The third one is you cut out criticism. This doesn't mean you lower the bar of expectations, although that may be tempting. It doesn't mean you don't correct your children. It just simply means you do it in a way that isn't critical, cutting, or cynical. Cutting out criticism means checking your tone, gauging your responses, and framing your disappointments in ways that will communicate your love more loudly than your frustrations. There is always a place for constructive criticism of our kids, but most parents are better at the criticism part than they are at the constructive part. Proverbs 15:1 reminds us, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." And then the last step is to replace condemnation with grace. We want to sit here for a little bit to remember this, to replace condemnation with grace. The gift of grace may be the greatest gift you can ever give your children. After all, it's the greatest gift God has given each of us. Grace gives second chances. Grace forgives. Grace lets go of wrongs. Grace focuses on the future and not the past. Grace covers a multitude of sins. So let's go back for a second to the examples of condemnation that I gave you earlier, but now let's apply grace to them. So instead of you never do this or you always do this, grace reminds us that no one is defined by always or never terms. We have a God of second chances, which is then the next one we talked about. When you bring up past mistakes over and over again, that's the exact opposite of grace and forgiveness. What God gives us and models to us time and time again is to not bring it up, to not hang it over their heads, and to give second chances. That third example that we struggle with, especially with teenagers, when we refuse to let trust be rebuilt after they've broken it. Again, grace offers second chances. It gives us redemption and hopes and works towards His best for our lives. And then that last example, when we begin to treat our children in a certain way because of their faults or shortcomings. Never let your child's sins define him or her. See your child through God's grace-filled, loving eyes. And while we all know our kids need a lot of grace, don't forget to show a little bit to yourself too. After all, we're all on this parenting journey together with lots of successes and lots of failures. Romans 8:1 reminds us, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Potholes, they are everywhere. The parenting road is a bumpy one. There's no doubt about it, but you can avoid some of them. And the two biggest potholes, the potholes of being disconnected from your children and then being discontent with them, are avoidable. Stay connected with your kids. Take intentional effort and hard work. Do your best. It takes sacrifice of your time and perhaps even some of your own interests. Stay content with your children. It's not always easy, but you can break the cycle of comparing, complaining, criticizing, and condemning. It may be a long, hard road, but don't give up. Remember, very few good things in life come easily. Having a great relationship with your children does not happen by accident. Avoiding the potholes is hard work, but it's well worth the effort. You can do it, and we are here with you. All right, so now take some time to download the reflection or discussion questions to use on your own, with your spouse or partner, or even in your small group. Enjoy your time.